I'm hoping that everybody realizes that this is a really complex issue and that it is a very complex policy landscape, not only a complex ecological landscape, it's a very complex political landscape. And so I'm really extremely grateful to all our elected political representatives who've take time out of their busy schedules to come today. We feel very honored that you are all here. So I'm going to really jump in right away. The first speaker up is Elizabeth May. I don't think she needs any introduction. And in terms of her extraordinary role in Canada in highlighting some of these important issues of also relating nature, climate change, social equity, and reconciliation and Indigenous rights. These are all the thorny issues that we're dealing with, and hoping that in some way there's going to be a shift in all of our policy landscapes that allows us to tackle these problems. So Elizabeth, first up, you each have 10 minutes, and I'm hoping you're going to be able to paint some of the pictures of what is, what could be, and what your wish list is.
Thanks, Briony. And it's a real honor to be with all of you. And thanks to the organizers, Transition Salt Spring, again, a tremendous richness of perspectives on blue and green carbon. And I love the graphic you did for this event, Briony. It's perfect. So with 10 minutes, forgive me if I start with a larger context piece, which I've been kind of ranting about in the chat. And that is that none of what we're talking about today matters for a hill of beans if all we have is the mediocre, unambitious climate plans from our own government and governments around the world. So because I'm reaching a lot of climate activists on this, and I have to admit to a massive career of failure, I've been working on the climate issue since 1986. I was part of the movement that thought we could avert the things that we are already seeing. I never thought, when I started working on climate back in 1988, I helped organize the first global scientific climate conference. I never thought that we would be talking about the things that at that time, Dr. Digby McLaren, who was the president of the Royal Society of Canada, told me, Elizabeth, you're not being nearly focused enough on the real downside. The real risk we face is runaway global warming and human extinction. And every other scientist I knew said Digby McLaren is really being too extreme. We'll never get to that. We don't have to worry about that. That's a theoretical, hypothetical possibility. But in those days, we also had Environment Canada scientists saying, if we don't act on climate change, and this is what they would say, by 2030, we could see the retreat of glaciers. So I don't need to tell you how much I'm keenly aware that the opportunities we once had to avert the things with which we now live, like the frog in the slowly boiling, warming pot of water, we're becoming accustomed to picking up the newspaper and reading, oh, permafrost thaw and has now made permafrost a net source of carbon. Oh, the northern mid-Atlantic currents of the Atlantic are slowing down. Oh, the Western Antarctic ice sheet. I won't go on. But the point is, we are up against some critical deadlines, and we have to act in all of our communications with a degree of urgency that says if we don't hold to 1.5 degrees in this decade, then all bets are off. And government's current Bill C-12, the so-called Climate Accountability Act, is absolutely dangerous. And so is our current target. And we have a good chance, I still think we've got a really good chance to change this, because there are a lot of good people in the federal cabinet. They're good people in government. The advice they're getting is poor. I would compare the Environment Canada scientists that warned the minister back in 19.
Okay. Elizabeth, I might just see if you can come on a telephone, if you can call me. I think what we'll do while we're waiting for Elizabeth is to move on to Adam. Adam, are you here? Adam's going to be coming in from the legislature. He's got the thankless task of being one of two Green MLAs and trying to hold up. There he is. Adam, hopefully you can chat. We'll come back to Elizabeth once she's we've got her back on. So again, Adam's our MLA for Saanich and the Gulf Islands, member of the Sartlip First Nation, and a real inspiration. And he's my MLA, and I'm so grateful to it. So Adam, you have the other thankless task of being in that legislature right now.
Well, I have thank you very much, Briony, and I have an incredible amount of gratitude for the people of Saanich North and the Islands who persist in putting me here and giving me this thankless task, although I am very thankful for the opportunity to represent this beautiful place, the Saanich North and the Islands, as it's known in this house. And I just want to acknowledge my relatives that are here on this call, my uncle Eric Pelkey, who will be speaking next, I believe, and as well my cousin Gord Elliott, and any of those others that I've missed, I'm sorry, but I just want to acknowledge my elders that are in the room. I think I'm going to take a slightly different approach than Elizabeth has taken, and I'm going to talk about the building that I'm in. I'm in my office here. This has been the former office of many people. I had learned that this is actually the former office of Gordon Campbell prior to him becoming the premier of the province. And so it's kind of an interesting thing, and noting that the only reason why I raise that is because every office in this place here has been occupied by somebody at some point in time that has had an impact on the province in the rules and the laws that are created here and the policies that we uphold. I think that I joined with just a few minutes left in the previous presentation, so my apologies for not being here for the entire presentation. However, I would say that the quote, "The province is slowly coming around," I want to address slowly, because it is painfully slowly, and every day that this province drags its heels on the issues that were raised in the previous presentation is a day that we lose biodiversity and that we lose these life-sustaining ecosystems that we all require. It's a matter of slowly burning the house down around us, as far as I can see. And yes, as the previous speaker mentioned, the government is always trying to balance jobs in the economy with ecological resilience. And unfortunately, because we live in a world, in a legislature here that serves the economic models and economic frameworks more than the people that they were elected to serve, jobs in the economy tends to win out over ecological resilience, over biodiversity, and over the ability for us to live and work and play in a healthy world. Some of the work that needs to be done in this legislature and around the policy and the opportunities is is decolonization. And I think that what's really important is that I define what I am talking about when I talk about decolonization. There's a mural in the rotunda of the BC legislature that has the 4 establishing industrial sectors of this province. Beautiful murals of fishing, of forestry, of mining, and of agriculture. And I would suggest the only one of those industries, well, there's 2 of those industries that continue to thrive in this province, mining and agriculture. And the forestry industry and the fishing industry have basically are in decline, and the practices and policies approach of the former member that occupied this office and many of the offices in this legislature have overseen the demise based on our extractive our extractive philosophy and approaches rooted in the colonial history of this province. Make no mistake, we are doing what we are doing today, what James Douglas brought with him on that boat. And that was to hew wood and draw water on behalf of the crown. And that's what we do in this province, is we continue to hew wood on behalf of the crown. And so when I'm to the benefit of the crown, and I think what's really important is that we understand that until we get to the root of why we're doing what we're doing in this province and understand why we're doing what we're doing in this province, everything else will be band-aids. Everything else will be empty words. We've been asking questions for the last week and a half, but indeed we've been asking questions for the last 3.5 or 4 years about old growth logging, and the rhetoric that we get is exactly the same. It might be rearranged, but it's the same rhetoric day in and day out, question after question after question, as the government tries to appear to do something while they continue to talk, they continue to log in this province. I look at the coastal Douglas fir zone and the beautiful graphic that Briony shared with us in advance of this, and looking at where a majority of those forests are there, it's on the back of our relatives. This is on the backs of our relatives, those Gulf Islands and the San Juan Islands. Those are the relatives, our Saanich relatives, and we might hear about more of that soon. We in this province, former policymakers created the Islands Trust. And when they created the Islands Trust to preserve and protect those beautiful relatives of ours on behalf of the people that live there and on behalf of all British Columbians, they failed to truly protect the trees that are on the backs of those relatives of ours. And so what we have is a situation where you've got a preserve and protect mandate without actually the tools that are needed for the people who are making the land use decisions to preserve and protect those trees. Because this province is oriented towards hewing wood, because this province is at its heart so rooted in its colonial history as a province, we don't see past those first European boats that show up to understand that the indigenous people that lived here, my relatives, myself, Wayne, my state, my family, and relatives, had a different way of living. Not a colonial approach to recognizing that actually we had thriving economies. They didn't require the extraction to the detriment of our own sustainability and our own ability to live in our territory, to the point where we diminished them to almost nothing. We see that with our fishery. You can count the number of salmon and the number of Saanich that go up the Fraser River now. It's a disaster. And our people would spend the summer in the Southern Gulf Islands engaged in a relationship with the Saanich that was since time immemorial. Now that process is now that relationship has been undermined and it's been destroyed. And so I would say that if we are going to protect the coastal Douglas fir, we need to strengthen the ability for the local government officials. And this is something that I've been working on and talking a lot about over the last number of months, that I've been honored to represent Saanich and Saanich North and the islands. It's a process that's currently underway. The minister just found out that today that I've got a private member's bill that's being drafted, because I accidentally copied her on an email to a bunch of other people. So maybe that'll light a fire, and I encourage her to write her own bill and create her own protections by increasing the ability for the Islands Trust to have more enforcement and authority, just essentially what the UVic Environmental Law Clinic has said. And so strengthening the ability of the Islands trustees to put in development, comprehensive development The words are escaping me. Anyway, strengthen guidelines and include enforcement to ensure that our island's trustees colleagues have the ability to regulate tree cutting, similar to what happens in municipalities. None of these are silver bullets. They require the political will of people around the table to actually do it, to have the difficult conversations with the community. But I'm going to be introducing those some of those policy ideas in a private members bill in an attempt to get this conversation started. Development permit areas. Thank you very much, Brian. So there's a handful of policy ideas. They're there. I'm going to start to enact or bring them forward to be discussed. And I'm also going to continue working diligently on the decolonization of our perspectives in this House, that we serve more than just the crown. We serve nature. We serve the world that provides us all of the benefits of being able to live in a safe and healthy place. And if we're only serving the crown, we are missing the point.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Adam. And Elizabeth, we're going to bring you back for your second
So
half.
sorry. Haishka to my brother Adam. That was beautiful. And I'm so sorry. I wrote in the chat what happens to me. I was in the middle of cross-examining a witness in finance committee the last time this happened. Someone downstairs in my building. I'm at the penthouse suite, the 4th floor of an apartment building in Sydney, right? It's not really a penthouse suite, I'm kidding. But when they ring the doorbell downstairs, it kills my internet. It's so charming. So someone delivered a book. Yay, I've now got Bill Deverell's new book, but I'm sorry for cutting out on you. So I was just at the hopeful turning point, which is that I'll take 4 minutes now, Briony, sorry for that. There's a change with the Biden administration. So it's, I don't know how many of you remember Dave Brower when he was the druid of the environmental movement as the former executive director of Sierra Club in the US. But he used to say, we used to say in the 70s that we have to think globally and act locally. Only now, he said, and this was sometime in the early 1990s, now we have to act globally and think locally while we think globally and act locally. And we have to do all four at the same time. And that's why a workshop like this, which is so focused on the Salish Sea and so important in terms of nature-based solutions, can't lose sight of the fact that we have some big global challenges that are also national, that are also provincial, that wrap up in political feet to the fire as soon as possible, please. So Joe Biden has created on Earth Day, April 22nd, a climate leaders summit, and Justin Trudeau has committed that Canada will change our target at that date. For people who missed it, and it was easy to miss because none of the environmental groups mentioned it or held the government to account. Under paragraph 24 of the COP21 decision document, Canada had agreed to increase our nationally determined contribution, NDC in the UN lingo, or target, in calendar 2020. And in the same document, we committed to improve it every 5 years thereafter. So it's very important that we expect our government to fulfill the commitments we made. And what the first Paris Agreement goal that we have blown by is paragraph 24 of the COP21 decision document to improve our target in calendar 2020. So now's the time. Please do whatever you can from wherever you are, whether you're in an NGO or a level of government in a nation-to-nation relationship with the government of Canada, push them to put in place the kind of target that's consistent with holding to 1.5 degrees, which we determined from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is approximately twice of what Canada is currently committed to doing, which is not actually on the current set of plans actually going to be achieved. We need to act like the climate emergency is an emergency that requires a whole of government approach, the way we responded to COVID. They didn't just say to Patty Hajdu as Minister of Health, see what you can do about this problem, Patty. We'll give you more resources than you usually get. But that's where we are on climate change. So to the point of nature-based climate solutions, they are now getting much more understood as a key part. The downside risk is that net zero by 2050, there are some, particularly in the oil patch, who say, we'll just keep producing fossil fuels because we'll buy offsets. And there is a point of offsets that at some levels reminds me of why Martin Luther nailed the protests to the papal door, that you can't buy your indulgences. We can't buy our way out of this. We have to actually do the work. We need a heck of a lot more sequestration. We need sequestration in our greens on land. We need more sequestration in our ocean-based greens. We need to do everything we can to enhance and enlarge every possible carbon sink at the same time that we commit fully to eliminating fossil fuels as quickly as possible. So that's a dual agenda. There's certainly, again, where you're coming at this, and I saw questions in the chat from Gary Holman and others, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if in budget 2021, whenever we see it, there will be accessible programs for replanting eelgrass for smaller scale projects at a community level. At least I'm pushing for those, and I hope they come through so that groups like Transition Salt Spring and others at a community level can say, we've got this piece of forest, or we've got this area for reforestation, or we've got this place where we're going to enhance sequestration. But if we don't deal with the large scale threats of tipping points into runaway global warming, accelerating permafrost thaw that we can't stop, those kinds of global threats can't be ignored while we find our local solutions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Elizabeth, as always, for encapsulating our thorny problems. So to go from the big national federal level, we're going to go to Eric Pelkey, Hereditary Chief, Quinum. I'm sure I never say that very well. I'm not seeing Eric on the, so there you are. Thank you.
Thanks, Gus. I thank Elizabeth and Adam for their words. I thank all the previous speakers and presenters this morning. I've been on here from the start, and I really appreciate your words and your knowledge and your actions and the things that you believe in. And I think that in my world, doing what you believe in is always of a high cost, personally and professionally. And so I really look up to people who have a lifetime commitment to things such as this. I am a hereditary chief of Tsawout. It's a part of the Saanich Nation. Our territory encompasses the Gulf Islands and San Juan Islands, the Saanich Peninsula, and over to Samiamu and Point Roberts, and on the mainland side, down to Elwha on the American side. So we are a pretty diverse nation, and one of the things that really really brings me back to these issues is the words of our elders that we don't own the land. We don't own the things that live on the land. We live with them. We live with the land. We live with all of the life that the land presents. But that the water and the land do not separate, though they live together. You cannot have one without the other. So we were always told our territory does not just stop at the water's edge, it goes out into the water. So we must take care of the water just as we take care of the land. The things that destroy the life in the water will destroy the life on the land. So you can't have one without the other. I appreciated those words about the trees being a community of living things, because that really also brought me back to the words of our elders, that all of these things are tied together. The trees, the plants, the soil, they're not just individual standing living things. They are a community of living things. And I see some new house construction where they leave a few large trees in their yard, and then they landscape all around it, all the way up to the tree with turf and lawn. And then they wonder why the tree eventually dies. It's because they've killed the community that supports that tree. They've committed, they've done away with the support structure of that tree. And no matter what they do artificially, they cannot recreate what they've taken away. Oh, I really believe in Indigenous sovereignty, that it would lead to Indigenous stewardship. So I'm really looking forward to cooperating with anyone who has the common goals of saving our environment, saving our ecosystems, saving our forests, and saving our waters. In my lifetime, I've seen even the clear cutting right around my own home, and people wonder why all of the medicines that we used to use are not here anymore. It's because they've cleared it. They've cleared all those things. They think that bushes are just bushes, but bushes are living things that provide. Even right across my house, there used to be fields of stinging nettles, and the land was cleared, and all those stinging nettles were taken away. And then now we hear our people crying for those stinging nettles that provided medicine to our people. So it's how you view things, and how you view the world around you, and how you view all the living things. I remember my great-grandmother admonishing me when I stepped on an ant. She said, that ant has the right to live just like you. And that ant is a contributor to the life that exists around you too. And just because you don't recognize that ant's right to live doesn't mean that that ant doesn't have that right to be here also. And if you carry on this way, you're going to be killing things that support your own living. So I always remember that everything has the right to live. I really, I've taken rides up into the back countries and seen all the clear cutting and stuff, and it breaks my heart. But then I come back to our area in Saanich here, and I see clear cutting happening right in our local area, where they take down whole forests, or they chop down entire mountains so people can live there. And we wonder why everything is going bad the way it is. Well, I just wanted to end this by thanking all of you. Thanking all of you for your presentations, thanking you for all your knowledge, and thanking you for all of your work. Hi, Trustee.
Thank you so much, Eric. We really value your endless commitment to educating the settler community about Saanich ways. I feel that this is probably one of the most valuable things we can offer, and Brian, in terms of transitions, is offering this opportunity for this diverse group of people to hear all these perspectives. So we're going to go to the region now, and Gary Holman. Gary's been both a provincial MLA and a regional director, and long-term land trust advocate. So is pretty versed on the multi-jurisdictional notion of the thicket that we have here. Thanks, Gary.
Well, thanks, Briony. I wasn't clear. I was you were wanting me to say anything today, but I really do appreciate the initiative here, and Adam, Elizabeth taking the time to be with us. Folks can probably tell from some of the comments that I was making in the chat, I tend to look at the world through the lens of how can I best, what's my role? And I know all of us do. And for me, that's perhaps a particularly narrow view, but I do try to focus on things that I think I can influence. And there certainly are, provincially, it's a challenge, especially if you're an opposition party. I've had that experience. But regionally, I think that the CRD is doing some important things, and I guess those are the efforts working in collaboration with Islands Trust that I'd like to focus on. And I do have a tendency also to focus on my backyard, and I take to heart Elizabeth's comments about thinking globally, acting locally. That is how I try to approach things, and I do think there are some important initiatives that we can undertake on Salt Spring and in the trust area that can make a contribution, not just in terms of mitigation and protecting forests and better protecting our marine resources, but also in adapting. And this may not be a popular thing to say within this group, but as a matter of fact, there are climate changes already baked in that we are going to have to adapt to as communities, and they're not necessarily adaptation and mitigation aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Like protecting forests, I think, has elements of both. Increasing food security. They are acting on both fronts in effect. The creation of, well, not the creation, the Transition Society has been around for a decade, but this is the group that has spearheaded Salt Springs' new climate action plan, which now does include an adaptation section, which our original plan was focused on mitigation, and the work of transition. They're proposing some exciting projects, looking for funding around these various protection measures, and I look forward to working with them. And just there are several things that we need to be pursuing. I was asking Elizabeth and Adam about the status of the so-called National Marine Conservation Area proposal for the Strait of Georgia, or or probably better named for the Salish Sea. And that's been a project that's been underway for over a decade. First Nations, not just participation, but co-management and leading that. I know Adam feels strongly, of course, about that. But there's an opportunity that we should be taking advantage of. My understanding is the focus of Park Canada now is to complete those First Nations consultations, but they need to be leading that project, and we need to be bringing First Nations, for example, as in Haida Gwaii, back into their historical role of stewardship and of helping to manage and enforce actual rules and regulations. First Nations should be doing that on our crown lands on Salt Spring. The province, while it certainly has not been addressing the old growth issue provincially, they have designated all of the crown lands on Salt Spring, some on Galliano, and I believe some on Southeast Vancouver Island as no logging zones. And I think those crown parcels, again, could be an opportunity for collaboration between First Nations and, for example, Seardy Parks or other conservation agencies to co-manage those parcels to ensure their protection and stewardship over the long term. Seardy Parks, which has over the past couple of decades protected about 10,000 hectares of forest lands in the Seardy. We continue to purchase lands. There's an existing land acquisition fund that in my view, we should be increasing. Taxpayers pay about less than $2 per month per household to support that land acquisition fund. And it's protected over 10,000 acres. Just think of what we could accomplish if we could double that. And that wouldn't be at huge taxpayer expense. And by partnering with First Nations, by partnering with other levels of government and NGOs, we could continue this success with that land acquisition fund. So those are just, that's the way I look at the world. There are locally a number of really important initiatives that involve partnerships with different levels of government and with First Nations that can really make a contribution in terms of both climate mitigation and adaptation. And yeah, I see my role as working with those various partners to make them even more successful than they have been up to this point. And Briony, you and I and others on this call have a history with the Burgoyne Bay acquisition, which was the South and West Salt Spring Conservation Partnership. There's a name for you. And we've been successful in protecting thousands of acres of land, including all of Burgoyne Bay on Salt Spring, by taking that partnership approach. And you'll remember the countless meetings we had with various agencies to establish areas of interest. And then when an opportunity came along and the funding came along, we had our ducks lined up. All of the agencies had identified the areas of interest, and we were able to act when the surf was up, basically. So that's been my experience and how I look at the world and try to make a modest contribution. And Elizabeth, to your point about I know you were joking about what you see as your failure as a climate activist. Just because governments are not responding, or for that matter, citizenry, and I take some responsibility for that myself, that certainly does not mean your advocacy has been a failure. By no means is that the case. We would be even less educated, even less motivated now, if not for your efforts. So I know everyone here on the call feels that way, but thanks to everyone, to Eric Pelkey for participating as well. And just thanks to everyone who's, I'm really interested in the devil of the detail around these carbon offsets, as a possible source of funding. I know there is, and as reflected in the question that was put up on the screen, right? There are concerns about the misuse and abuse of these tools. And Brian, I think they're worth pursuing, but as you say, we have to make sure we're achieving the highest standard. And I'm interested in working with various partners in applying some of those tools here locally. But thanks so much for organizing this event.
Thanks so much, Gary. You're right on time, and thank you for all your work over the many decades, quietly trying to see what's being done. It's difficult in this existing policy void environment. And next up will be Deb, who's right in the with the Islands Trust, a trustee, dealing with some really challenging worldview issues. Deb, maybe you can jump in now on that particular.
Sure. I put my broader website in the chat window. I think it dropped in there. If not, I'll catch it. So really thankful to be living and working here on the Saanich territory, and do want to take a minute just before I speak to also acknowledge Eric Pelkey, Greg Elliott, Lauren Underwood is also here, and just some of the island trustees that are here. Doug Fenton and Steve Wright are on the call, so acknowledging them, and the staff, Claire Frater and Delani are also here. I'm going to talk both on a personal level, because I can't speak for the whole trust as a council, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the trust and related to many of these blue-green carbon issues. As many of you probably know, I co-wrote the climate change emergency motion for the trust 2 years ago with Scott Colburn from Gabriola. And my whole reason for becoming involved in the trust was about issues that Elizabeth has named and others about how are we moving these things forward faster. So I would highly encourage all of you to become trustees in the future. If you have these agendas and wish to move these things forward in this way. I am still working full time and very much in the climate empowerment space, trying to understand and work with communities around how we lift voices and local knowledge and First Nations like depth of knowledge and gifts that they give forward to us to think about how we need to be and act in this space. So a grateful acknowledgement to that wealth of understanding that we seem to not hear well as settler colonials all the time, but need to. So a couple quick things in terms of, in the trust, I feel like we're really trying to sort out the process. There's very much a colonial structure that is the government that we're working within, and as we move forward, at the same time the climate change motion was passed, we also passed a reconciliation motion 2 years ago, and those two things interwoven, we're trying to unpack and figure out and do in a real way. And so it's with like deep respect and appreciation that I name First Nations, many trustees, Elizabeth, Adam, in the co-creation of the Southern Gulf Island Forum that hopefully will allow us to talk across all these different levels of government and proactively get at some of these issues instead of reacting, which is what I feel like has been done in the past. So really excited about building relationships and working more holistically, like folks have talked about here. Around land acquisition, while I agree that land acquisition has been very successful in the past, as like Gary was talking about with Burgoyne Bay, and want to name that Rain Coast Conservation has done some recent things on the island where I live, as well as many other things, and the conservancies in the area. All of those things are important, but we also just need to manage every inch of land and sea. Like these can't be things where we do something in one area and it forgives us from acting in an appropriate way in another area. So we very much need to do everything in all contexts at every moment we can at this point. In terms of the trust, we're doing a few things around forest management with the CDF toolkit. I do encourage everyone in the trust area to nag their local trustees about enacting the Coastal Douglas Forest toolkit in the local trust area, because we're a federation and each of the local trust areas have to enact those bylaws internally. So nag on those issues. And we're working on some internal processes that hopefully will make bigger projects like the water sustainability project recently becomes more of a regional project. So hopefully that'll improve the efficiencies at getting some of those things in place as policies. Also, in terms of the carbon offsets that have been talked here, actually one more thing about eelgrass before that. So eelgrass, we have done a lot of mapping of eelgrass in the past, which is a component of what we can do, and implementation of bylaws and some of the local trust committees related to that mapping. We have additional funding in this next year to do more of that work, but the partner that we had planned to work with doesn't necessarily have any. So everything you can do to fund sea change right now would be greatly appreciated, so we can actually get that additional mapping done. And that's the basis that we need for many of the bylaws to make them very like gritty and easy to enforce, is we need to have data to be able to base those on. In terms of some of the carbon offset policies, so I'm gonna not talk on behalf of the trust for a second and just talk on a personal level. Carbon offset issues, well, you know, they've been well explained today. I think it's clear what they can do for us, where their limitations may be. I have concerns about carbon offsets from the perspective of long-term goals. For short-term, I think they're a fine transitionary mechanism to get us to move and be different. From a long-term perspective, we honestly just need to live differently, and we need to be differently in the world. And that's not going to be a simple thing. And many people will argue with you that that's not a realistic thing. I would say, I sure hope it's realistic, because I don't know, like the environment is essentially reacting already in deep, profound ways all over the world. And if we don't do something differently, it's not going to get better. So carbon offsets are a stopgap measure from my perspective, but they're not the solution, the long-term solution. I also have some concerns. I have seen carbon offset measures where it concentrates pollution, and often that can land in vulnerable communities, particularly for First Nation communities or others who are living in marginalized contexts politically or sociopolitically. So I have some concerns about carbon offsets. And also, I, on a personal level, I also think about sometimes the idea that we have all this energy like being spent toward an economic model of carbon, you know, counting and measuring. What if we took all that energy and actually put it on social solutions that were about actually being differently in the world? That's my dream. So in terms of other things that are going on inside the trust area, I am the chair of the Trust Programs Committee. And in June, the trust policy statement will be updated. All of that work will actually start to name different levels of prescriptiveness on policies trust-wide. I highly encourage everyone and anyone to get involved, and encourage everyone and anyone they know to get involved in and communicate with your local trustees about that work, CCing the trust itself as well, so that we can make sure that that communication is clear and your trustees are acting on your behalf. So, and hopefully that'll have some really clear recommendations on like what policy, it'll have clear statements of policy on what should be happening in all local trust committees. Last thing maybe here as I finish up is just around advocating with the province. As Adam said, you know, like, and thanks so much again to Adam and his work around forestry. We can advocate as the trust area, and it's helpful to advocate as a holistic body. And we have been, I think today or tomorrow, tomorrow, I think there's conversations going on around that. And really thinking about like, how can we actually have some control over forest preservation, over eelgrass preservation that's more holistic in nature and not so fragmented across different layers of government. It would be extremely helpful, because the number of times people phone me about clear cuts, and I like went around and took photos of clear cuts today on my own island. And the number of times I get phone calls and I can't do a single thing about it. because the province holds tree cutting authority right now and not us. So it's, you know, we can advocate and we continue to do so. But, you know, all of the letter campaigns that we can have of people naming that as an issue to the Ministry of Forestry would be really helpful. So thanks very much for having this session. Things like this are also really important so that people can learn and debate and think with each other about solutions. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Deb. It's sure not easy being on the front line dealing in this political landscape. And I thought I might just try and pull together some of the points that everyone raised just to set the context for the questions as they're coming in. And just to give you a context about why this forum really emerged is that this came from a lot of calls for help. Eric and the Saanich Leadership Council, where it was a call of their priorities to try and restore the eelgrass, to bring back the herring, to restore forests and food sources. And and then the Islands Trust were calling for incentives to try and push landowners towards stewardship and away from clear cutting. We have had calls for co-management, where what does that look like, and how do we, as in these different weird jurisdictions, prepare ourselves for co-management, and what do we need to do to get our own policies? So these are all things that have kind of been coming at people involved in trying to solve some of these thorny issues. And it really, I think, boils down to there's this at the front line, there's people wanting to do something, but there's no money to do it. And they want to do something right away because the policy world is there's a void. And now suddenly we have a federal initiative with nature-based solutions. And it creates this sort of ethical question of whether we should be putting our energies into these nature-based solutions, which actually generate models and livelihoods and things to point to as a community that can help move us to a shift in worldview. This shift in worldview, I know I've been waiting for it to happen like Elizabeth since 1986, when Margaret Thatcher was at the University of Edinburgh. I'd gone over there and where it's a lot worse, like, let me tell you, saying, oh yeah, we got to do something. And there's just been this policy void. And so many of us are saying, well, maybe we need to create some refugia and at least get going and doing something. So I think that's where the debate is. And I'd like to start with a question for Eric. In your view, what might be the next steps for designing co-managed carbon projects in the CDF?
Well, I think that there has to be a willingness of the jurisdictions that exist around us and with us to engage with us and go into co-management projects. You know, we are entering into co-management negotiations with Gulf Islands National Park, and we're also willing to engage with other entities and other governmental levels to talk about co-management projects, and especially in regard to saving our environment, saving our oceans. We have an open door to people that are willing to work with us. Thank you.
Thanks. And I just note that Colin said, Colin Campbell, I think you can all read it, but should we be calling offsets instead of set-offs, which is because they're relevant to the decolonization of our thinking. I don't know, Adam, you might want to jump into that question. Will it help our decolonization to actually start on these transition projects?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. It's gonna, I might just fill the air with words for a bit while I think about what the impact of that will be. However, I think what I'll do is I'll focus on language just in general and semantics. I think one of the things that we often find in the legislatures or the House of Commons or in politics, and I think probably my relative sitting around the table on the other side of the table from the colonial governments would acknowledge this as well, is that there's an awful lot of words that are used, but it's the action on the other side, which I think is really the most important thing. And I'm going to be going and getting ready for question period in an hour, and we're actually going to be talking about exactly this. And it means, I think what's important is that it means that these words and playing around with words and playing around with the meanings of words means a lot to these bureaucracies, but it means little to the natural environment. We can play with words all we want. What we need to do is focus on the policies that are actually going to achieve them. And I think that, you know, Gary's made some important, and this isn't to minimize Collins. I have yet to really think about exactly what the difference between offsets and set-offs would be. However, I do want to elevate, I think, the situation that when your introduction of me and talking about the position that I'm in, and to Gary's comment about being in opposition, I think one of the benefits of the role that I'm in right now is that I can talk about issues that the other parties are not necessarily willing to talk about. So when Sonia and I first stood in the legislature 2 or 3 years ago and raised issues around old growth, the discomfort in the room wasn't just from the government who had to answer the question. The discomfort was on the other side of the house as well. There was genuine discomfort everywhere. And I think what's important is the way that our colonial structure works here in this legislature is that there are ways for that, you know, as long as there's an agreement in this bipartisan place that there isn't going to be a conversation about an issue, then those questions never get raised. And so the value of being in opposition, while it's not easy, none of this should be, it shouldn't be easy being in government either. There is a real benefit and a real freedom to being in the seat that I'm in, because I can raise the uncomfortable questions, and I'll continue to raise the uncomfortable questions. And I think I really, really want to emphasize the point that I think Deb made, just with respect to supporting your island's trustees, to supporting your CRD directors, your supporting your MLA a lot, then your MP, as we stand up and raise these uncomfortable questions, and as we do things outside of the status quo, because there's nothing easier in government than just to fall into the trap of advancing the status quo. And that's the easiest thing for us to do. The most difficult thing for us to do is to step outside that box and do something different. And those that are doing that difference, making that difference, need to be supported by the community around them.
Yeah, just to jump in, Briony, I mean, and thank you. I mean, we're so lucky here. I mean, look at our elected representatives and our First Nations leadership. But what I feel the sense of, we've moved ourselves into a different space where we're talking about nature-based solutions, which is really important. And I don't want to ever suggest that it's a binary choice, that we either do nature-based solutions and work locally, or we do what is necessary to be screaming, like Greta Thunberg says, our house is on fire. So yeah, the house is on. Now, Briony, you and I were arrested at Kinder Morgan blockades, right? And the government that got in power promised that they would use every tool in the toolbox to stop this pipeline. Are we living in some kind of alternate parallel universe where that no longer matters, that we've been betrayed? Does it not matter that we stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline? Does it not matter that we not let diluted bitumen into the Salish Sea? And so, and because of COVID, the protests happen in a very different space. So people are tree sitting in Burnaby, trying to stop trees from being cut in Burnaby, protesting up in Kamloops and Shuttlecook territory. And yet it's as if it's so diffuse. It's as if it's over. It's not over. We have to stop the TMX pipeline. We can't build infrastructure for fossil fuels for another 30 years. And guess who the evil multinational corporation is that's building that pipeline? It's us. We bought it. All of us are shareholders in the thing we were trying to stop. So I just, my plea becomes a bit, I don't know, I don't want to be unhelpful, but we have to actually say that all these things matter. It matters that we put our attention to protecting and expanding eelgrass. It matters that we get some funding to do nature-based solutions in the Salish Sea. But it also matters that we don't leave the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and the Squamish to fight on their own to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We bought it. We're about to spend another $12 billion of public dollars on something that when Joe Biden says we're canceling Keystone, our prime minister's first act in conversation is to protest that to Joe Biden. I mean, I'm saying the obvious things. I'm preaching to the choir, but I'm just saying, don't set your anger aside because everyone else seems to have forgotten. We're still in the same place we were at, Briony, when we didn't move when they read the injunction.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, before you go, I have a quick question for you. I don't disagree. People are trying to go from maintaining a duality, and I think it's kind of like having a schizophrenic personality, that you continue to work on these little refugia while we argue for the larger. And I'd love to hear the other panelists weigh in on this, is the power of a pilot, the power of a model, the power of a region doing something right so that people can see it and they don't characterize it as something crazy in their heads, which is sort of one of the things that we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, I just would say everything we do matters. The only thing that is a bad choice is to do nothing. So yes, do everything you possibly can, but there are not going to be any refugees in the worst case scenario. We actually have to go off fossil fuels as quickly as possible, or nothing else we do matters. Everything we do will matter as long as we don't lose sight of that.
So I would say everything that Elizabeth just said, and I would say that I've been really involved in some national and international level work, both in Canada and the US, around how we understand what we can do. So there was a comment earlier, I think Gary made it, about like public education and empowerment work. And, you know, that is not to be underrated, because one of the things that governments are not being brave enough about, like one of the reasons governments are not brave enough, is because public opinion behind them gets loud and crazy and uncertain and like diverse. And we need to unify public voice. And so one way to do that is to just like blanket public community spaces, and it's best done community-based, community to community, like this, you know, educating each other, talking to each other, like working with each other. And those examples of what we actually do together and how we work together, writing about those and lifting those examples in every way possible is something that's needed so that other communities can be done, and they can like take that learning and not start at ground zero. And so that idea of a pilot, Briony, that you're naming, and like how we actually do that kind of work, the way that we lift that kind of is actually really critical. And it's interesting because yesterday morning, I think I got an email from the UN. I sit on some issues around education, outreach, and education, communication, outreach. I'm like at the UN level around thinking about how we're actually mobilizing public towards climate action. And there's a new series of conversations going on in that space right now that are trying to actually see pilots. They're trying to look down into local levels and lift those into the international level so we can learn across contexts. So always local work is actually, it's kind of what Elizabeth was saying earlier, that local global interaction space, we have to be doing that all the time.
There's a lot to digest here. We have about 10 minutes more, and I'm just wondering, there's some very specific questions, and then there's also these philosophical ones about how really we apply our time and energies. I think I'll start with just some really concrete questions that have come, and this one's to you, Elizabeth. And maybe it also comes to at the provincial level, Adam, which is there are some taxation tools that we could be using. One of them is, you know, the inheritance tax, a broader use of NAPTEP, the Natural Area Protection Exemption program. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about federal and Adam, maybe at the provincial level, some tax incentives that we could work on too.
Well, when we look at the whole fiscal framework and we look at tax and in relation to climate, first thing that needs to be said is it makes no sense whatsoever to be spending billions of dollars in subsidies to fossil fuels when we're supposed to be about carbon pricing. So the first prime minister to commit to ending Canada's fossil fuel subsidies was, believe it or not, Stephen Harper in 2009 at a meeting of the G20 in Cincinnati, I believe. And of course, the Liberals in 2015 pledged to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, and again in 2019, and yet they keep going up. They've increased dramatically at the provincial level. I'll leave Adam to speak to that. As Horgan has plowed money into fracking and LNG, Trudeau's plowed money into other LNG projects and new subsidies, obviously TMX, because we bought it, and that's as I define it, that's a subsidy. Catherine McKenna wasn't sure if spending 16 billion on a new pipeline was a subsidy or not. I won't delve too deeply into the subsidy question, just to say we have to stop. At the federal level, certainly I've done a pre-budget submission to Chrystia Freeland, whom, by the way, I will confess here full on. I mean, I may be dead wrong here, because I usually have been found historically to really like people I shouldn't have liked. But I really like Chrystia. I think she's super smart. She's more influenced than people will know in terms of the media coverage. She's heavily influenced by people like Joseph Stiglitz. She's heavily influenced by Mark Carney. I have hopes for the next budget to be better than what we're getting out of Environment Canada. I think we might get better stuff out of Finance Canada than Environment Canada, and I never thought that before. So we need to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. I don't know if she'll do that. In terms of taxes, yes, we need social justice, which means we need guaranteed livable income and pharmacare and a number of other projects, which will entail a change to our taxation structure. And I would think that looking at inheritance tax isn't nearly enough. We need a wealth tax. We need to figure out how to go after the offshore money that's hidden. I don't know how many of you saw the Fifth Estate special not long ago about how that KPMG scandal and all that money that's at the Isle of Man ripping off Canadian investors with no real consequences. Whereas in other countries, after something like the Paradise Papers, other governments went after that money. The Canadian government hasn't very much. So looking at the tax structure, there's a lot we can do. Raising carbon taxes by itself as a pledge, which Trudeau did on December 11th of 2020, that we were going to go to $170 a ton by 2030, is certainly not a bad thing to do, but by itself, it's meaningless because we have not yet got a plan to reduce greenhouse gases within this decade such that we can hold on to 1.5 degrees. So where there are a lot of words being used, as Adam said, we can fill a space with words. I like to stick to one simple concept, 1.5 to stay alive. Past that, nothing else much matters. That was what all the delegates from the African continent were chanting. Dirk may remember this. I think you were there with the delegation of Papua New Guinea, Dirk, but chanting 1.5 to stay alive as all of the African delegation marched out of the failing UN talks in 2009 in Copenhagen. It's still true. And so that's, as a brief comment, just try to be as brief as I can, that's where I'm at.
Okay. Adam, do you have anything to add provincially that could be something constructive and simple that we could push for?
Yeah, I have something to add. $12 billion for a Site C dam and $6 billion in direct subsidies to the, I mean, I can just add on to the subsidies, taxpayer and ratepayer funded subsidies, tax measures. Yesterday, what happened in the legislature was left, I think, Sonia and I speechless when a BC Liberal member stood up and said, "Thank God, that the BC Greens stood up and walked out of the House when we were voting on a clause of the Income Tax Amendment Act, or else the NDP would have been able to give more money to the LNG industry. So there's something quite surreal about a BC Liberal standing up and saying, you know, thank God the Greens walked out of the room at the right time so that we could win a debate on how much money we're handing over to multinational companies. So I think that this is part of the challenge that we face here, is that there are a lot of tax tools, and in fact, a complete revision of the tax code in this country and in this province is something that we need to be taking a look at, and exactly what it is that we are incenting. There was a question earlier on, maybe you were planning on getting it to me, although it is kind of outside of the context of this conversation, around the speculation and vacancy tax as an example, and the application on the Southern Gulf, or in the Trust area and the Gulf Islands. And I would just say to this, or around the taxation, is that there is a direct conflict in the housing taxes, as an example, where we have a perspective since the Second World War that housing is a commodity rather than as a place to create comfort and safety for families. And so these are at odds. And I would say that if I were to round out my comments around the decolonization of this place, it's about our mindset and it's about our perspective. So there's a whole pile of taxes that we could use to incent the kind of behavior that we want, no question about it. And we could have a whole event to just naming what those initiatives are. The initiative that you're raising, Briony, is an important tool in an entire, full comprehensive packages of tools to get the kind of outcomes that we're looking for. Why I've focused on political will and on the mindset that's in this place, the colonial mindset that currently besets this place, is because for me, in order for us to be able to get the support for those initiatives to be deeper than just the words on paper, that the government means it, that the bureaucracy is empowered to do something about it, I'm going to be raising in question period, and this is a secret, don't tell anybody, but I'm going to be raising in question period in 30 minutes the idea of conservation financing as a way and as a primary tool to get the government to stop logging old growth and work with First Nations. So there are a host of opportunities and a host of tools. What we need is the political will around the table to have the perspective that we need, that's built around resilience rather than that's built around short-term, basically vote buying schemes, for a lack of a more elegant term to use.
Okay, that's a great segue to the final question, which is there a specific pilot project that we can work on that any level of government is willing to back? And I'm going to start at the regional level. We haven't heard from Gary, and it does rely on funding coming from different levels of government. But Gary, maybe you can jump in on this one.
Well, I think partnerships with First Nations, for example, around Crown Land, the National Marine Conservation Area. Elizabeth indicated in the chat that those discussions are underway, and there needs to be more time. But specifically on Salt Spring, the Crown lands on Salt Spring that have been designated no logging, but with a caveat for First Nations interests. And I have broached this with CRD Parks. I broached it with Ruth Waldick and the transition folks who are applying for funding for various pilot projects. So I think it's on their radar as well. So that's just one example that would or could involve First Nations in a partnership, and not just protecting but managing. Like, for example, a key concern here is fire risk, and one of the for folks who are speaking against the Trust Initiative to better protect our coastal Douglas fir, talk about, and I don't think I don't think with accuracy, but basically suggests that protecting forest land means you're increasing forest fire risk because we suppress fire. And so I don't, what's the solution then? You clear cut your forest to make sure you're not increasing the risk of fire. But Crown land protection also means management and addressing that fire load. The fuel loads on our Crown lands and protected lands are probably too high, and so there's a modest suggestion for the Gulf Islands, collaborating with First Nations on protection and co-management of Crown lands.
And we've got 1 minute. I'm just thinking, Elizabeth, maybe you could speak to, have you got any intel on these nature-based solutions that could at least kick off, get cash in the hands of local people?
Well, I just say, I think there's a lot coming. I'm hoping, if you look at the fall economic statement that Krista Freeland put out, I mean, there's a lot disappointing. There's stuff missing out of the speech from Throne and fall economic statement that we should have seen by now. I know I'm a little bit off from nature-based solutions, but I keep wondering, where's that Just Transition Act that we were promising election? There's things we were promised that we need to be able to make the transition we need to make, which is even the word transition. I know I'm talking to Transition Salt Spring, but what we need to do now is more disruption than transition. It has to be quite rapid. But I do think nature-based solutions will come. I tend to get down to a real nitty-gritty level, Briony and others. Like, I know the people who are in the Minister of Environment's office, and I'd have to say the smartest and most creative person is the one on the nature-based solutions file. So I have more hope and expectation around getting some good, useful programs out of that. I'm also very keen on the Indigenous Protection and Conservation Area program, which recently set aside the jumbo ski win, getting rid of that horrible ski resort. I don't know how many of you tracked that, but it was a First Nations and local communities and huge, not quite yet defined in terms of boundaries because they're dealing with local First Nation. I'm afraid I'll say the name wrong, the Quansick Nation. I'm saying it wrong, but they are going to have to draw that line. But it's a big protected area within this Indigenous Protection Conservation Area concept. So Paul Manley and I've been working hard to try to draw attention to people to the 8,000 square miles, which is the Vancouver Island set aside for the ENN Railway grant back in 1871, which I know is not in our region here, but violates Indigenous rights and took a whole lot of territory out of any biodiversity protection. We're hoping we could get maybe an IPCA in there. There's a lot coming down towards us on nature-based solutions. And for this region, still more mitigation. We're going to see a lot more money for electric vehicles, I'm hoping we're going to see more money on interties to make our electricity grid work. But the problem is we don't see consistency. So while we're seeing a lot of good climate programs, you can add them up on one side of the ledger that says, 2 million acres. Thank you, Eric, thank you so much. I was expressing square. I don't know. I can't do the math in my head between square miles and acres. Anyway, between all of the things that are being offered, and they say, okay, we're going to have $15 billion new spending in climate programs. You say, fantastic. And then there's 17 billion just on Trans Mountain expansion. So you have to say, eh. So I do think we're going to see good things coming, but we have to remind ourselves to push for what's needed.
Yep. Thanks so much. Sorry, Deb, I wanted to bring you, but I think we're at the end of our time. Thank you all for coming here.
You say my brother Adam had his hand waving madly there. Adam, did you get to say the thing you were going to say?
Adam, let's hear from you. Deb.
No, I'll just keep talking. I just want to thank Elizabeth and to Gary and to Deb and to my uncle Eric for their incredible leadership and in their communities. And I think that what you see here with specifically the 5 people that you have on this panel is an example of the level of collaboration and that we've been able to achieve here. We work very well across the different government jurisdictions. And I'm very much looking forward over the next 3.5 or 3 3/4 years or whatever it is, the shortest part of this period of time, to continue working with my colleagues, because we've made a great strides forward in recent times, and I think that is going to serve us all and our communities very well.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and back to you, Shauna.
All right, thank you, everyone. That was so informative. Thank you for all of your contributions. We're going to jump into a final breakout room now. So there's 3 different breakout rooms. You can place yourself in these rooms. There's the policy aspects, the technical aspects, and the international example. There'll be some information presented to you and then plenty of time for questions underneath that umbrella. So please place yourself where you are most curious, and we'll have a report back afterwards just so everyone can kind of get on the same page and so no one really misses anything.